December 19, 1777. Washington and the Continental Army arrives at Valley Forge, a place infamous for the brutal experience that soldiers were forced to face with in one of the lowest points of the War for Independence. Through dramatic retellings, George Washington's role as commander of the Continental Army during the American Revolutionary War has been celebrated through his many portrayals by historians and films, attempting to exemplify his leadership skills through the tough times and harsh winter conditions he and the Army experienced. However, during the winter encampment at Valley Forge, Washington faced a significant crisis in his handling of the army after his failure at the Battle of Brandywine and Germantown. An attempt to remove Washington from command and replace him with Gates, known as the Conway Cabal, greatly threatened Washington's control of his army. While historians debated whether this threat was significant, it deeply influenced Washington to solve the emerging supply crisis that wreaked havoc amongst soldiers at Valley Forge. As the British drove the Continentals out of Philadelphia in the aftermath of the Battle of Brandywine, Washington believed he had one more chance at Germantown, a small village 6 miles north of Philadelphia. Washington's initial plan involved attacking British forces under the command of General Howe through 4 different columns, led by General Smallwood, Nathaniel Greene, Sullivan, and Armstrong. Lord Stirling commanded a reserve force in the background. On the day of the battle, there was a heavy fog that greatly aided the element of surprise for the Continentals, as Sullivan's column charged into Germantown. Sullivan's forces were able to rout the 2nd Light Infantry Battalion. However, Armstrong was not able to break through the Hessian outpost. Greene and Smallwood were also able to push the 1st Light Infantry Battalion, Queen Rangers, and Guards into retreating to Germantown Avenue. However, as Sullivan's forces rushed into Germantown, the 2 companies under the 40th Regiment retreated into Cliveden, residence of Benjamin Chew, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania at the time. Artillery forces under Brigadier General Maxwell and a part of the reserve force under General Nash were ushered in to defeat the British hiding in the house. The commotion and noise of the intense cannon and musket fire from behind their lines caused Sullivan's forces to retreat to destroy the British. However, this gave ample time for the British to reorganize themselves, forcing the Continentals to retreat out of Germantown. To Washington, it would have been a hard setback considering how well thought his plan was to deliver a victory for the Continental Army. After the defeats at Brandywine and Germantown, as well as the Delaware ports of Fort Mercer and Fort Mifflin, Washington moved his forces to Valley Forge on December 19, 1777. Valley Forge was described as a secure location for the army due to the high ground provided by the natural plateau and was reported to be, quote, virtually impregnable, end quote, by British General Charles Grey. A day's march from Philadelphia provided the Continental Army time to prepare itself for any possible attack from General Howe's forces. Moreover, by moving toward rural areas of Pennsylvania, the location provided greater access to general resources necessary for the army, specifically food. However, historian Wayne Bodle points out several other factors that influenced Washington's decision to choose Valley Forge, specifically the thoughts of Washington's generals and the Pennsylvania government. One major point Bodle makes was Washington's consideration of a winter campaign. The Continental Congress strongly believed that the army could pursue an effective offensive against the British. Washington's indecisiveness would further be exemplified when he asked his top aides about the practicality of a winter campaign. An indecisive conclusion based on differing opinions only complicated his willingness to actively engage in a winter campaign. Moreover, demands from citizens and the state legislature of Pennsylvania to protect the state at all costs, required Washington to stay in Pennsylvania and compromise on the location of Valley Forge due to the reasons mentioned previously. Washington's ability to balance not only the differing opinions of his aides, but also the views of the Continental Congress and the state legislature of Pennsylvania, demonstrated his ability to unify the differing opinions in creating a realistic plan for the army in the winter of 1777 to 1778. Growing concerns over Washington's recent failures to fortify and defend Philadelphia through his losses at Brandywine and Germantown, which caused the Continental Congress to flee, fueled anger and suspicion at Washington's ability to lead the army to victory. President of the Continental Congress, Henry Lawrence, wrote how he, quote, wished he was well acquainted with the man whom I think, all in all, the first of the age, and that he would follow my advice. He accepts the opinion of some who have no superior claim, all vanity apart. End quote. In other words, Washington's perceived inability to command due to his dependence on counseling with his officers was viewed as a strong weakness. Bates's success at Saratoga led many to question and criticize Washington and his commanding abilities, setting the stage for the disgruntled attitudes of members of Congress to question if Washington was still the right leader. Washington would soon be alerted to the contents of a letter by Brigadier General Thomas Conway to General Horatio Gates, who allegedly wrote, quote, Heaven has been determined to save your country, or a weak general and bad councillors would have ruined it. End quote. When Washington discovered the contents of this letter, Conway denied writing those words. However, he would criticize Washington by indirectly implying his dependence on his aides, writing, quote, Your modesty is such that although your advice and counsel is commonly sound and proper, you have often been influenced by men who are not equal to you in point of experience, knowledge, or judgment. End quote. While Conway attempts to downplay the accusations, his strong dislike of Washington's dependence on his generals, as pointed out by Lawrence, is seen as a blatant weakness of Washington and a sign of his indecisiveness. Very soon, however, Conway would be promoted to Inspector General to train the army and maintain discipline. However, his eagerness to reform the army would only be met with an indifferent Washington, who mentioned the unhappiness of the other generals at Conway's quick promotion and implied that his promotion was not based on merit. Conway responded by reminding Washington on the delirious state of the army, unprepared and diminishing in power, and insulted Washington by writing, quote, The general and universal merit which every promoted officer might be endowed with is a rare gift. We see but few men of merit so generally acknowledged. We know but the great Frederick in Europe and the great Washington in this continent. End quote. Conway's sarcastic letter of comparing Washington to King Frederick of Prussia, an attack on the aide-de-camp who always supported Washington like subjects would to a king, was enough evidence for Washington to report the incident to President Henry Lawrence and avoided responding to the letter. Not only did Washington mistrust Conway, but he began to feel uneasy with General Gates, whose contradictions on the initial letter of Conway made Washington question the support of his officers. Furthermore, an anonymous letter, as reported by Henry Lawrence, was being spread, arguing that Washington was failing in his duties. Washington was being cornered. Before delving into how Washington addressed the supply crisis at Valley Forge, it is imperative to consider the situation that the Continental Army was currently in. The loss at Brandywine cut the army off from the Delaware River, preventing the shipment of essential supplies of food from reaching the army. The lack of meat made the Continental Army increase its dependency on wheat, causing further stress on local farmers who were hesitant to sell their stocks of grain because of the devaluation of continental currency and preferred to sell it to the British troops at Philadelphia due to the value of British currency. The commissary department, which was in charge of procuring essential goods such as food and ammunition, and led by a quartermaster general, was in a financial crisis. Unable to carry out its function, Congress began debating on possible solutions. The new Board of War, composed of General Gates, Thomas Mifflin, and other statesmen, proposed to delegate the powers of the Quartermaster General to itself, increasing its regulatory powers over the army. Gates's appointment as president of the board was a signal of his ambition to replace Washington as commander. As president, Gates did not have to consult Washington on any army-related matters. As historian Wayne Bodle noted, quote, "Recently victorious generals seldom leave the field for the powerless desk jobs," end quote, implying that there was an ulterior motive in their search for, quote, "a significant role in continental military affairs," end quote, emphasizing Gates's personal ambition to lead the army. Manipulating the opinion of Continental Congress to address the supply crisis by increasing their power began to threaten Washington's autonomy over the army, setting the army in a precarious state and highlighting Gates's ambition to take the army out of Washington's hands.
In late January of 1778, the Continental Congress sent a committee of 5, consisting of Francis Dana of Massachusetts, Nathaniel Folsom of New Hampshire, Joseph Reed of Pennsylvania, Governor Morris of New York, and John Harvey of Virginia, to investigate the actual conditions of the army at Valley Forge. Washington quickly wrote his recommendations for the issues that the army faced with the help of Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton, believing that it was the right opportunity to emphasize reforms that were necessary for the army, in contrast to the plans of the Board of War. Washington's extreme care, shown by his large list of recommendations, and the fact that the committee found no mismanagement of the Army's records, convinced them that Washington was deeply invested in their collective efforts to improve the Army, rather than simply defending his critics to keep his position as Commander-in-Chief. His recommendations included a guaranteed pension for officers that was half of their salaries, standardization of promotions in the Army,
and the Quartermaster General position to be reformed. Washington would conclude, quote, "The disagreeable picture I have given you of the wants and sufferings of the army and the discontents reigning among the officers is just a representation of evils equally melancholy and important, and unless effectual remedies be applied without loss of time, the most alarming and ruinous consequences are to be apprehended. I have the honor to be with very great respect, gentlemen, your most obedient servant," end quote. The report from the committee would convince Congress to adopt its recommendations, discarding the Board of War's plans to launch an expedition into Canada. Washington's letter convinced the committee of his efforts to bring upon change that would significantly benefit the army, rather than criticize the actions of the Board of War out of malice. While not all of his recommendations were quickly adopted, Washington was able to avert the possibility of the Board of War exercising their full potential over the army by providing more reasonable solutions. While Valley Forge was indeed a tumultuous period for the Continental Army, the Conway cabal threatened to some extent Washington's autonomy over his soldiers. It is difficult to imagine the outcome of the war had the board's proposal to invade Canada been attempted. However, members of the Conway cabal would soon realize that their efforts to reorganize the department would fail due in part to the Committee of Five and their collaboration with Washington. Washington's honesty, coolness, and response to the threat to his power prevented the army from collapsing due to the actions of the Board of War, exemplifying his ability to navigate through crises, which would prepare him not only for the Continental Army and its future successes, but in the future endeavors of the early years of our country.